That's
Hi,
right.
everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. It's very good to be with you today. Today we have a very special guest. Yuval Levin is a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's someone who I think anyone who follows American politics knows Yuval's stuff somewhere or the other. And even if you don't know that it's Yuval, it's Yuval. So Yuval Levin, it's an honor to speak with you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Yuval, we're in a crazy time, I think, in the world. Here in Israel,
Yes.
we're waiting for Iran to kill us, and and in America, we had, I think, we're recording this on August 8th, and the past, I would say, maybe 30 days have been like the craziest days I mean, maybe
Yes.
ever in condensed time. You had the debate where Trump basically knocked Biden out of the race. And then for like 2 weeks, there was a time when the entire Democrat Party was pressuring the sitting president to get out. Finally, they kicked him out. At the same time, a few days before the convention, the former president, current nominee, gets shot in the head. And then it's like, I'm thinking about it, it's crazy. So, and then the convention, then Biden drops out, and then Kamala Harris becomes the vice presidential candidate, and now she picked her presidential candidate. Now she picked her vice president, the governor of Minnesota, and that's where we are. And we're about to get into the Democrat convention. And my first question is, because we're talking about so close to when Kamala Harris picks Tim Walz to be her vice presidential candidate, is, as a Jewish person in Israel, we've heard a lot about that. One of the main reasons that she did not pick the Jew in the race, Mr. Shapiro from Pennsylvania, was that he was Jewish. How much should we believe that? Is that true in your opinion?
I think it was certainly a factor. I don't ultimately think that it was the deciding factor. I think that Kamala Harris, in looking at her options, made a choice to avoid having a presidential ticket with two coastal lawyers, two elites who went to big law schools, and one from California and one from the East Coast. That's really not the way to run for president in a populist moment in America. And I think she made a choice for someone who feels more like a populist candidate. He was a high school teacher and comes from the Midwest. I'm not sure how much all of that matters. And I have to say, I don't really think there's a lot of evidence that the choice of vice president actually matters very much in deciding election results.
Yeah.
But I certainly think that the fact that Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania was Jewish was a factor in how the left reacted to him. Everybody was saying this as though it were about other people. You know, people in Michigan aren't going to like that he's Jewish. But they were really saying, let's not pick somebody who's Jewish. And it was very hard to avoid that in the conversation they were having. But it wasn't the only factor at the end of the day.
But the fact that we have a major party that, it seems to me, is better at this point, at least 50-50, that she might be the president in a few months, and that she's even taking into consideration that the fact that he's Jewish might be problematic, quote unquote, is, I can't believe we're in a day. It's
Absolutely
unbelievable to me.
And look, this, if she had picked Shapiro, he would have been the second Democratic vice presidential nominee who was Jewish. The first time that happened was in 2000. And at that time, the Democratic Party saw it as a strength. They were appealing to Jewish voters. They also thought in general that it suggested they were more open-minded. And here we are 24 years later, and the Democratic Party feels like it's a risk they can't take. That really does speak of a change in American life and in American elite culture in the direction of anti-Semitism that is undeniable. That has happened.
Yeah, it's just very sad. That's just my looking from here. What the Democrat Party it's still, I think, the majority of Jews will vote probably for the Democrat ticket, and it seems that there's sort of an unease. It's like two different factions. You have the Jewish faction, and you have you mentioned the Michigan faction that does not really like the Jewish faction. So, I think it's not going away, this issue, and we'll see it in the future. I wanted to ask you, one of the things that I think that you a lot talk about is the importance of institutions, and maybe the erosion of the importance of the way people think of institutions in America and maybe in democracies at large today. And it seems that we have the progressive side as it's been moving in the past. Maybe we could call it the woke, although I don't really know what that means per se. But it seems that a lot of the way what they're putting their weight on is to basically tear down the major institutions of American society. So, for example, you'll have what President Biden just came out with, the Supreme Court thing of packing the court and term limits and all that kind of stuff, and like trying to push down an ethics thing that Congress will eventually be in charge, and the police, and we've seen that since Black Lives Matter, and all these different things where it seems that, and even with the protests now with the Palestinians, is that they're taking down American flags, putting up Palestinian flags. How much do you think that this sort of erosion of American institutions and is permeating into American society at large, or is it just the fringes?
I think there's been a dramatic loss of confidence in American elites and American institutions that has defined the politics of the 21st century in the United States. And it's happened in different ways on the right as well as the left.
Yeah.
And what you describe on the left is a very, very powerful and energetic force in the politics of the Democratic Party now, which is turning against the structures of the system. And a lot of the arguments being made on that front are made in democratic language, as if these institutions stand in the way of some big majority that is legitimate but restrained by the Constitution or by the courts or by the Electoral College or by the Senate. There isn't actually this majority. It isn't there. Elections are very close, and American politics is roughly 50-50. But a lot of energy is being devoted to attacking the core institutions of the American establishment from the left. At the same time, large portions of the right have been losing confidence in the people who are running our institutions. And those people have been politicized toward the left in the view of many conservatives. People who run the universities, people who run some government institutions, including the FBI and some law enforcement agencies that in the past have traditionally been thought of as more on the right. There's a sense that what woke has come to mean is that every institution is trying to advance a kind of radical cultural message, so that on the right, too, you see a tendency very much embodied in the movement around Donald Trump, reject the establishment institution and instead advance a kind of popular front. There's less of the language of democracy on that side, but it's very much a populist and popular and in that sense democratic movement. The striking thing about these two competing populisms is that neither one of them actually has a majority in the country. And I would say in general, the thing to notice about American politics in the last 25 years is that neither side has had a majority. We have been at 50-50 for a very long time, and that's actually very unusual in the United States. America's always had a two-party system, almost always. And generally speaking, when you look in on this country, at any given time, you'd find one majority party holding together a really complicated, messy, kind of incoherent coalition, and a minority party trying to expand its coalition. And for the last almost 30 years now, since the middle of the 1990s, we've had instead two minority parties. And they define themselves against each other. They're not really working on coalition building or coalition maintenance. They're working on mobilizing their base of voters. Because to win, you got to get every last voter out. And that means you think less about winning swing voters or people who might go either way or people who are on the other side but actually should like you. That's traditionally how you win in a democracy. It has not been how our politics has worked for a long time. I think the turn against institutions and against elites has a lot to do with that. And the general flavor of American politics in the last 25 years has a lot to do with that. It's driven by a not so much polarization, not that the left and right don't like each other, but deadlock. The left and right are at 50-50 over and over and over. And so losing an election really narrowly is not the same as losing it in a big way. When you lose big, you think, well, we got to do something different. When you lose small, you think, let's just do the same thing and we'll win next time. And that's what both parties have been doing.
Just on that point, maybe the right in terms of that has maybe a point here, because the
Absolutely.
fact is that in the last, I would say, Trump administration, whether you liked him or not, he was basically sandbagged from the beginning. The institutions themselves, like you said, were being used to go after him, to try to stop him from implementing different parts of his agenda. We remember the I don't know, Russia Gate, I think we could call it, where he was from like the before he was president. The head of the FBI goes to meet him and then leaks to the media that he showed him the dossier, which it turned out wasn't real, and all this kind of stuff. And the like you said, institutions are very, very important, but it seems that one side is using them to advance an agenda, and the other side is losing its belief in them because of that use of to advance the agenda. What is there any remedy to this? I think about this a lot here too.
I think there's a lot of truth to that, and that the way that I think about how it happens is that institutions in our public life have come to lose a sense of boundaries and limits on what their role is. So that rather than thinking we have one job to do, they think we have a platform here that's very valuable and powerful, and we can use
Yes.
it to advance the broader cultural and political agenda. So over and over, you find institutions in American life, and it's not just in government, although it is in government. It is the FBI playing the part of a kind of political institution. It's journalism. You see it in corporations too, where you know a big company wants to get involved in a debate about abortion or about election laws, and you just think, well, I don't know, you make shoes, just let me buy your shoes, and I don't need to
Exactly.
know what you think about this, because now I know that I disagree with you and I don't want your shoes anymore. That's how you lose trust. I think elites in a lot of Western societies have become a little confused about why people trust them. And trust is a complicated thing, but oftentimes people with authority think they're trusted because they're competent, because they've proven that they can do the work. And that's true. And of course, people lose trust when you're incompetent. You just can't do your job. But another very important factor is that people trust you because you're restrained, because they have a sense that there are things you would not do to them.
All
So
right.
you trust an accountant, not just because they're good at math. Everybody can use a computer now. You trust an accountant because that's a person whose signature on the paper means that what's here is true, that this person looked this over and decided that it is the right accounting. You trust a journalist because what that person says to you has been through some process, and you
Yeah.
trust that process and therefore that person. And a lot of what's involved in that is knowing your limits. I don't say something that hasn't been through that process because I'm a journalist. That's very important. Or there are things that a doctor or a priest just isn't going to do to you. And when they do, you lose trust in them
Yes.
and in the institutions that they represent. So when it turns out that a journalist is just another political voice, when it turns out that the FBI is just another place where one side of our politics gets to advance its agenda, it becomes impossible to trust them. And that kind of politicization has had a lot to do with the decline of trust in elites in the United States, but also in Europe and throughout the world now, where elites just can't help themselves but use institutions to elevate, first of all, themselves, their own brand, but to elevate themselves as participants in the big cultural battles of their societies.
Yes.
And when you just use the fact that you're a president of a university to take part in some big political fight, well, people are going to think less of your university. There's no way around that. And I
Yeah.
think over and over, elites in the West are making this mistake.
And that maybe is one of the reasons, because I remember when Donald Trump was elected in 2016, a lot of these elites, like you call them, were in shock. They couldn't believe, I
Right.
think, that I remember the New York Times editor at the time, I don't know if he's still there, he said, how could this happen? We didn't send reporters to Middle America to understand what was going on with all these people. And how could they, we couldn't believe he was candid at the beginning. Before they started the Russia hoax thing, there was like a month where they were trying to think where they went wrong, and he said,
Yeah.
we didn't understand, that we didn't speak with the people, and after there was like a month where there was sort of a mea culpa where they said a lot of, especially on the media, and I think also politicians said we should have been more attentive to people in Wisconsin, people in Pennsylvania, or whatever. And then after a month, they went right back
Yeah.
to, well, all of them are racist, and it must be that disinformation. And then they started going after the Twitters and the Facebooks and everything, instead of trying to think of where the disconnect was happening.
This is where I really think it actually connects to the kind of deadlock point I made before, that when you lose, you rethink. You do in politics ask yourself, well, what did I do wrong? What did I
Right.
misunderstand about the voters? What can I do differently? When you lose narrowly, you're inclined to persuade yourself that it just didn't really happen. And of course, famously, this happened in 2020 on the right. Donald Trump lost narrowly, and he's literally said, no, that didn't happen. That wasn't a real election. But something very similar to that happened on the left after 2016. Some of it was very similar. I mean, Hillary Clinton really said the Russians stole the election. There was an
Yeah.
illegitimate election. But I think a lot of people fell into basically blaming a kind of abuse of the institutions they control. So you start to see a lot of people talk about misinformation, and let me tell you, I think the evidence in retrospect suggests that misinformation on Facebook played no role at
Right.
all in the 2016 election. But there was a massive kind of infrastructure of academic work built up around misinformation and disinformation because people just could not explain to themselves how this election happened. There must have been some kind of outside force. That tendency to spin conspiracies was just about as strong on the left as on the right. It just had a different feel culturally, and so it didn't seem as strange.
Right.
But I think that that shows a sign of poor health on both sides of American politics in a very powerful way.
Yuval, I wanted to ask you about the conservative movement in America because I grew up in New York and then I moved here, and I've always been, I would say, to be, I think, more on the right than the right of center, and always follow conservatism and read conservative literature and all that. And it seems that there is no, at least in the past, maybe since Trump, but probably a little bit before, there is not one conservative movement anymore. I interviewed Yoram Hazony not too long ago, and he's from the National Conservative Movement.
Right.
And then you have people from I guess National Review, and people from the old guard, sort of, so to speak, and you have the Trumpers and you have the MAGA movement. Where is the conservative movement today? What does a conservative in America mean?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. One way to answer it, and the one sense in which there is a coherent right, is that in a two-party system, the right is the anti-left. And conservatives do agree that the left is a problem. And in that sense, I think Yoram Hazony has a lot in common with the National Review folks and other things. When you turn to asking what are we for, rather than who are we trying to stop, then the right is much more divided than it used to be. And I think Trump is part of the reason for that. Some of the tension is about Trump personally, is a sense that Trump is somehow unfit to be president and to be the leader of the right, and therefore to accept Trump is to betray certain core conservative principles. I frankly have this view myself. But it's not just about Trump. I think there's a much more profound kind of disagreement internally on the right about the direction that American conservatives should take in 21st century America. And I think the right has been trying to figure out the essence of its coalition and its intellectual project since the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago. It's a long time now, but the history of the right since then has been a series of phases of trying to formulate a post-Cold War right. The Cold War really unified the American right because it brought together people who hated the Soviet Union for different reasons into one camp. Some of them were religious and communists or atheists. Some of them were capitalists and communists or communists. Some of them were foreign policy hawks, and the Soviets were America's most significant rival and enemy. And so they held together through opposition to the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union disappeared, the question, what holds us together, became a live question. And in a sense, the question was, which of these camps is really in charge here? What is the right? Is the right socially conservative? Is the right capitalist? Is the right foreign policy hawks? Various people have tried to hold it together in various ways. George W. Bush, first of all, I think, tried to advance a kind of social conservative vision of the right, but then because of 9/11 and Iraq and Afghanistan, became really a foreign policy president. In the wake of that, in the Obama years, there was an effort to advance a kind of policy vision for the right. And Trump is, in a sense, a third wave of trying to figure out a post-Cold War right. And in this case, populism, critique of American elites and institutions, as we've said, and which is also, in a sense, a critique of some economic conservatism, a critique of market economics up to a point. The right is still having this fight. I don't think any of these camps has won, again, because the Republican Party has not built a broad, coherent electoral coalition, has not won a persuasive majority. So that argument continues, and there's no doubt the American right is internally very divided and dynamic
Yuval?
and fighting itself.
You phased out for a second. I wanted to say that in the last Republican convention, I'm pretty sure there was not even one speech about free markets in the entire convention. There was, if you look at the Republican platform under Trump, which supposedly, according to reports, he and his close team were on the hot button issues. They were the ones, for example, on abortion. There is no the wording is very, very different than ever. Very moderate, very non-committed. It's just very, religion is very, very, it's very, very watered down from what we, even 4 years ago. And I think obviously a lot of it is because Trump wants to win, and he realizes that especially abortion is probably a very big problem in some of these swing states. We've seen that at different special elections where the left has been able to mobilize especially younger women to go out and vote because of this issue. But the fact is that you can't just, to win an election, it's very important to win first and foremost, but you can't just totally, it can't be that the only reason why this is happening is just because they want to win. There's something deeper here in terms of the beliefs that the Republican voter is changing, it seems to me.
To me, the problem here has a lot to do with Trump's personal gravity, with the way in which the conversation on the right has become a conversation about Trump. And in a way, the conversation between the right and the left has also been about Trump now for 8 years. And part of what we're seeing now is that the various factions of the right are not really able to exercise a lot of leverage over Donald Trump, because a large portion of the electorate of the party identifies him with their rejection of the left. Trump is the person most hated by the left and therefore most loved by the people who hate the left. And the different factions of the Republican Party need him more than he needs them, which is a very strange situation to be in. It's not generally how people run for president in the United States. Even in 2016, that was not the case. Trump needed the social conservatives and the religious Christian voters. So he needed to tell them, if you vote for me, here's a list of people who I will make judges. He literally produced a list, or I will do this and that on abortion or on tax policy. And look, he kept some of those promises and broke others. Everybody does that. But he made those promises, and many of them were kept because he felt a kind of obligation or reliance on factions of the party. The striking thing about the 2024 election is that he's not doing anything like that. He's not really promising anybody anything. And he's not particularly running on any policy platform. He's running on Donald Trump. And a lot of the party's voters are willing to allow it. And so some of the factions of the party, the anti-abortion groups themselves, signed on to the platform, even though it amounted to a rejection of them, because they had to show their constituents that Trump was on board with them rather than the other way around. I don't think that's ultimately a durable way to hold a coalition together. I don't think this kind of personalism is really how American politics can function. And look, Donald Trump is 78 years old. He's not going to be dominating the party like this forever, but he is now, and he
Yeah.
may win. And if he does, I think this does go on at least for these 4 years. And in the process, the right is forgetting how to function as a coalition a little bit. And people are losing sight of how to negotiate with each other, how to make demands, how to make concessions. The coalition just isn't working that way.
Yeah. Maybe we can jump to the left coalition just to pose it, because like we said in the beginning, we mentioned two different factions, which was the Jewish voter and maybe the woke and the Muslim voters in Michigan, which you mentioned, and they've been it's for a long time been talking about the non-committed in the primaries against Biden. But I think more than that, and on a basic level, you have the progressive wing of the party, and you have, which are usually younger and way more radical than the old guard Democrats. And you have this older generation, and maybe we could just take two names. I was thinking about it. Chuck Schumer, both from New York, which lived next to, I grew up in Crown Heights, so he lived in Park Slope. And not too far from there, you have AOC, who's this younger version. There's been rumors that she wants to take Schumer's seat at some point, but regardless, the fact is that the younger people, the newer generation, the fresh face, she was called in a few of these articles when she came up, the fresh faces of the Democrat Party are these radical progressives. And it seems to me that a lot of the old guard are so scared of them, they refuse to stand up to them. I think the best example is when Ilhan Omar said something about the Benjamins and the Jews, and they refused to specifically call out anti-Semitism in the resolution in the House. They had to call something more general about hate, and they didn't name her. And so where do you think they're going with this?
The interesting thing to me about the Democratic Party is it is still much more of a traditional coalition. There are factions. There's not this one big personality at the center of it, so that the differences are a little more ideological, a little more substantive. The Democratic Party is also more self-consciously a coalition of factions. There's labor, which still matters. There are some racial and ethnic factions. Black leaders in the party still have some sway over voters. It's really kind of how Joe Biden won the nomination in 2020. And what you find is that there is, just like you say, this huge generational divide within the party, where younger people are much more to the left than older people among the Democrats. Some of that is just younger people are generally more ideologically extreme than older people, but there's also a kind of living memory within the older generation of Democrats of losing really badly by being too far left. The Democrats in the 1980s and into the 90s did very, very poorly because they were perceived by the country as being too far to the left. In 1984, Ronald Reagan was reelected, winning 49 states, the largest presidential landslide since George Washington. And the basic reason for that was that people perceived the Democratic Party as being too far to the left of them. And Democrats learned from that, and they ran people like Bill Clinton. They ran Southerners who were used to talking to more conservative voters. They moderated their views on crime, on foreign policy, and they ultimately were able to recover politically for that reason. This younger generation of people who were only born in the 1990s and after has no memory of that. All they remember is a squishy Democratic Party that refuses to really take strong positions on the left. And they're frustrated by it. And they want to push the party to the left. I think that the American public in general is not changed enough for that to work. And they would lose badly if they push too far to the left. Some of their leaders realize that. Maybe Kamala Harris realizes that. She's 60. She's sort of between these generations. But she's from California. Who knows? I think they run a grave risk of getting way too far to the left of the country here. and losing as a result. But right now, you'd have to say, looking at our party system, that both parties are trying to lose, and
Yes.
so it's very hard to draw lessons when one of them loses, because it mostly the winner is always a function of who is less intolerable.
Yeah.
That's a politics that's hard to learn from.
Um, but the fact, like you said, the Democrats are more ideological now since Trump, because Trump is Trump. So you're voting either for Trump or against Trump. And when you're voting in the Democrat, a lot of the factions, the ideology is more visible today, just because of that fact. Um, but let's take Tim Walz just because he's the pick. It does show some sort of maybe an ideological turn, because, like you said, the vice presidential candidate is not doesn't really change the dynamics of the race. At least, I think maybe you could own the when you said it doesn't change the. I think I remember who said it. It's do no harm when you pick the
Yes,
vice
that's
presidential
right.
candidate. So Tim Walz in Minnesota, I was looking before when it was picked. I wrote an article for my newspaper, and I'm looking at his record. Let's say Black Lives Matter is in his state. George Floyd is killed in his state, and he refuses in the beginning when I think the second largest city in the state is being destroyed, and he refuses to call the National Guard. And his wife is interviewed on TV and says she loves the smell of the burning tires of these fires that are burning down the stores in her city. By the way, urban people from the inner city, black people usually, whose stores were destroyed and neighborhoods were ransacked, and then also on social policy, for example, now it's starting to be this big thing: tampons in boys' bathrooms and all that kind of stuff. And saying that before 5 days before he was picked, he said in a White Dudes for Kamala Zoom call, which the name is in itself very weird, he said that socialism for one person is neighborliness for another person. And so, does that, just in general sense, the fact that she didn't go with a more mainstream person, the fact Shapiro, with all the baggage of being Jewish, is at the end of the day a governor of a swing state. He's 60+% approval rating. He seems pretty moderate, his positions. He's not crazy. And then you pick this guy. He seems folksy, nice as a person, but his positions are crazy.
Yeah, Tim Walz is a very interesting example of how the Democratic Party has changed over the course of the 21st century. He first ran for a House seat in 2005 as a moderate, and a seat that had sometimes been held by Republicans, and which he won as a Democrat. He was in the middle on guns. He tried to avoid talking about abortion and gay rights and various things. And over time, as he held that seat, and then as he ran for governor, he became more and more ideologically on the left. And that's because the party in his state became more and more of a left-wing party. Minnesota is not a swing state. It is voted for a Democrat for president all but one time since the Second World War. It is not at all a swing state. I mentioned before that Ronald Reagan won 49 states in 1984. The one state he lost was Minnesota.
Yeah.
And so the choice here is not a swing state choice, where, as you say, Shapiro from Pennsylvania, a state that swings back and forth, it's very much 50-50, is a very moderate governor. His attitude is, I'm not going to mess with your life one way or another. I'm just trying to fix things when they break. That's the kind of governor he is. And the choice she made was not for that, but for someone who has who has put himself on the left on some very key issues. I think it tells you something both about her sense of her standing in the party, that she needed to prove something to the left so that she's not attacked from her left. They're going into a convention here that could be very, very messy. And I think if she had picked a moderate, it might have been more messy than it otherwise would be.
Yeah.
That's part of it. But I think she also has a sense of where her voters are and how you win. That's going to be tested. Let's put it that way. I think it's to the left of the country, but we'll see.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about Israel, but let's just stick on that. The messy convention that maybe what you mean is, I think, the big protests that we've been seeing, that they're probably going to converge on their convention. She is the vice president, and there is a war in Gaza now. and we're going to see it no matter who the vice president that she picks is.
Exactly, and she's been pressed on it already. There was an incident just yesterday where there was at one of her rallies, someone started to scream about Gaza.
Yes.
And what she said in response was very interesting. She didn't say I agree with you. She didn't say I don't agree with you. She said, if you want Donald Trump to win, then keep doing that kind of thing at my events. Well, that's really interesting. That's a way of saying let's not make too much noise until we win. I was not, just put it mildly, reassured by that message. I think we're going to see a lot of Gaza and Israel related protests in Chicago at the Democratic Convention.
I'll just put one more thing that today the New York Times, you probably didn't see it, is just reporting that yesterday she met with leaders of the undecided voters in the primaries in these states, people who organized the vote, not undecided, undeclared or whatever, for like when Biden was running, and they pressed her to commit to an embargo on weapons to Israel, and she didn't say no, that's what the New York Times is reporting, that people in the room said to the New York Times that she said, she was saying that we'll talk about it after the election. So the fact that first of all, the fact that she's meeting these people is like unbelievable, but because when Trump was meeting different people that were anti-Semites or white nationalists and all these kind of stuff, rightly so, people were angry at him from all sides, and he had to disavow it, and he apologized, and Trump usually doesn't do that, we all know. But she is meeting with pro-Hamas people, and not only does she not feel the need to apologize, it's being leaked, and it's fine in the party, I guess. So that's like you said, more of the left, where we're seeing where they're going. My question about Israel is, before October 7th, and this is a question about institutions and maybe where the difference between different types of conservatives. Before October 7th, we had like about 9-10 months since the new government came in and until October 7th happened. And during that month, that period of time, within the first 2 weeks of the government being formed, they announced their judicial reform initiative. And we right away saw giant protests right next to my house. The former Attorney General lives of Israel, and there was just huge protests here for hundreds of thousands of people every Saturday night. There was days where the traffic was being blocked. You had soldiers and officers in reserves signing that they won't show up. There's different now discussion how much that convinced Hamas to do what it did. Regardless, the point of the judicial reform here was the right was the one that was pushing it. It is an anti-institution bill, meaning the point of it was to take away power from the Supreme Court, from the judiciary, and bring it to and give it to the the government and the parliament. Where does that comport with anything that the right in the conservative movement in America? Is that a conservative thing to do?
Well, look, I think that the conditions in Israel are different in a way that's important to see. That the Israeli regime, the Israeli structure of government, is very undefined, whereas the American one, in some ways, is excessively defined. We have a written constitution here that establishes some very precise distinctions between the power centers in our government. And a lot of what courts do is actually to facilitate the operation of that system. And the courts, in that sense, are constrained by the written constitution and by the law. And some of the arguments are about how constrained should they be. In Israel, there's a real absence of structured institutions. Israeli democracy is excessively centralized. I think there's a one-house parliament, and there's very little distinction between the executive and the legislative, even less than in many other parliamentary systems. And of course, the judiciary is really barely defined at all. It arose, I think, for good reason, to put some restraints on the power of the Democratic power center, so that there's some way to restrain an elected majority. That's what courts do in a lot of systems, but they generally do it according to law or a constitution. And in Israel, they just do it. So that I think what you had in the fight over the courts are two sides that had a very good argument, where one side says, where did the courts get the right to do any of this? How are they telling the elected government that it can't appoint this minister? And on the other hand, you say there have to be some constraints on the power of majorities so that you can't just have this really narrowly elected majority that now thinks it can do anything it wants without
Yeah.
anybody telling them anything. There has to be a balance of power. And because that balance doesn't exist in Israel as a formal matter, it has to somehow be negotiated between these branches. I think that part of what the people pushing the reform were saying has echoes of what the right says about judges in America. That judges have to be constrained, that judges should be selected in ways that are accountable somehow. And part of what they said absolutely does not, I think, have echoes and is not really conservative in any sense, which is they just wanted to empower the Democratic majority without
Right.
constraint. They said, we won the election, and that's the end of the story. I think it's very important that majorities never imagine that they define right and wrong, that they define foundational rights. That's not really how it works, because there has to be a limit on democratic power. The protection of minority rights and individual rights has to be balanced with the legitimacy of majority rule. I have to say, from a distance, Israel's done this very poorly, and it has to be
Tell me
somehow
about it.
thought out. It's hard to imagine any kind of constitutional convention at this point among Israelis, not only because Israelis are famously disagreeable, but also because those kind of conventions happen early in the lives of nations. Israel's a very developed society.
Right.
It's been around for the better part of 80 years, and it's very hard after that long to redesign the structure of government. But some redesigning, I think, does need to happen.
Well, I would just say that I would be so against having a constitution here with this population, because the factions that, for example, the 64 seats that the majority of the Knesset has of the right, you have half of those seats are ultra Orthodox parties. I'm Orthodox. I go to synagogue. I keep Shabbat, but I would not want those parties having a say in individual rights, like you said, and the constraints on the government, and the there is no separation of religion and the state here, but they probably want to make it way more than it already is, and the different, I would not want and there was a reason that Ben Gurion, the first Knesset, was supposed to do a constitution. And I think there's a reason why he didn't go for it, because he knew what kind of constitution he was going to get. So,
and the downside of that is the kind of fight that happened before October 7th. And ultimately, look, it has to be resolved by negotiation. I mean, that's how democracy works. And I think that what the mistake the government made was to try to push it on a relatively narrow majority rather than to try to negotiate with other parts of the society that I think would have been willing to talk about it at the beginning, at least.
Yeah. And especially when I would just say, I think this also goes for America. When you one of the things in the US, maybe you could talk about it, is that when I was a kid, a lot of the presidents and leaders of parties would come and say, we did bipartisan legislation. We got this done bipartisan. It's not just Republicans. It's not just Democrats. We brought people from the other side and we negotiated and we got this good bill for everyone. And nowadays, you don't hear that a lot. You don't hear it, and here in Israel, you don't hear it either. And we just spoke about why you don't hear it and why it's so bad, but you don't hear it. And I wanted to ask you, in America, why that is. Is that all contributed by the just hatred between Trump, or is that way before that?
I think it is before. There's been a kind of polarization of the parties where the idea that what politics is for is negotiation has declined in popularity. And the notion that ultimately building coalitions is a sign of success doesn't come as naturally to people now. I think part of the reason in the United States has to do with the structure of the electoral system, where the parties turned over a lot of their control over candidate selection to a primary system. This happened around the world, but it began in the United States. And primaries are rather strange. Primaries assign the core work of the party, selecting candidates, to a narrow sliver of the party, the most intensely active members of it. And those are the people who least want to see compromise. They
Yeah.
don't want to hear that you're working with the other party. They want to hear that you're giving nothing to the other party, that you would never give an inch. And so people run for Congress saying, I'll never give an inch to the other party. Now, the thing is, the job of a member of Congress is to negotiate. There's no
Right.
way around it. And so I do think it's now considered to be a bad sign when a politician says to voters, I'm going to work with the opposition. And even when they do it, they don't say it, right? So we have some bipartisan legislation. It happens all the time. But that's not what people run on. People run on, if you vote for the other side, the sky will fall.
Yes.
That's now the only way to motivate voters.
By the way, Yuval, can you just explain, just give the example of when Kevin McCarthy was the Speaker of the House? And I think that's a great example of it because he basically was thrown out of his speakership by a handful of members of his caucus that were angry that he negotiated with the other side.
Basically, yeah, for doing his job. I mean, the Republicans have a very, very narrow majority in the House of Representatives in this Congress, only 3 seats out of 435 seats in the House. And so everybody's vote matters. And a group of members basically threw out the Speaker, the leader of the party in the House, because he had negotiated a budget agreement with the Democrats. And so eventually, at the end of the day, the budget passed because enough Democrats were willing to vote for it, along with enough Republicans. That's the job of the Speaker of the House, but he was literally fired for doing his job.
And the new Speaker is basically doing the same thing, which is which it just goes to show that it wasn't it was like it was a show vote. They kicked him out because they wanted to show their base that they were fighting the whatever.
That's right.
I have a few very short questions. We mentioned the big protests against Israel, and I think against Jews in a lot of cases. And I grew up in an ultra-Orthodox community in Brooklyn. There was protest outside of synagogues where I grew up, and if you're protesting against Zionism and Israel, and if your whole case is that Zionism isn't, and anti-Zionism isn't anti-Semitism, to protest outside a synagogue, I think proves the other point. But
I think this is actually very important. Israel has a presence in the United States. You can protest in front of the embassy if you don't like what Israel is doing. If you're protesting in front of a place where fellow Americans who are Jewish are worshiping, then you're protesting Jews. You're not protesting Israel.
Yes. So what do you think is the future of Jews in America? Not as like, I'm not asking you as a Jewish person, but as a political scientist, someone who studies the U.S., somebody who we know that there's always been a strain of anti-Semitism in America. I think usually it came from the right historically, from the extreme right, but we are seeing, I don't think we can compare what anti-Semitism today on the right versus what we've been seeing this past year plus in campuses, in Jewish neighborhoods like I just mentioned, and there's no comparison. And where is it going from here?
I think the hardest thing to tell is how widespread it really is. So if you ask the question of American public opinion, there's very broad support for Israel, first of all. More than 80% of Americans support Israel in the war with Hamas.
Yeah.
Which you wouldn't know from our politics, but there it is. And very, very few people, of course, will tell a pollster that they don't like Jews. On the other hand, here are these elite institutions, universities to begin with, but also you find it in journalism, in political culture, you find it in the Democratic Party.
In
Hollywood. There's a tremendous, at the very least, tolerance for open anti-Semitism. And of course, it's more than tolerance, it's engagement in it. And I think what happens in the elite of the culture matters. It sends a signal to people about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. You can't be a racist in Hollywood. Rightfully so. You just can't be. Your career would be over. And that's a way of sending a message to the rest of the country that says racism is out of bounds. Obviously, there are still racists in America, but our culture broadcasts the message that this is wrong. That is now not happening about anti-Semitism. It is just simply not. And when a young American thinks, well, what are the limits here of what I can be and what I can say and what I can do, the message they're getting is, among the views you can have is that Jews are oppressors and a force for evil in the world. I think that is extremely dangerous, and I think the fact that we see it playing out this way in elite universities suggests something about how these ideas could spread through the culture that should worry us tremendously. I have always thought that living in the United States means you're just living in a unique place when it
Yeah.
comes to a kind of openness to the Jews. And I increasingly wonder if instead I've been living in a unique time and that time is ending.
And do you, instead of wondering, I want to ask just your solid opinion. Just
Yeah.
obviously you haven't studied it per se, but just the way you look at things. Do you think that Jews in America are going to have to adapt in a way that Jews in Europe, for example, have had? So if you're in Europe, you can't wear a yarmulke in some of the capital cities of the biggest. In Paris, I had friends who they took off their yarmulkes because they were told, do not wear yarmulkes, it's too dangerous in Paris. Or London has these giant protests where Jews are being beaten up every Saturday, and with just lots of videos all over the place. And do you think that because when I grew up, you could walk around, I had the whole, the hat, jacket, and the beard and everything, and no one said anything. People were very nice. And I wonder today if I would have flew back to New York and walked around, how I would be met.
So look, I think generally speaking, you still can do that in American cities, and people do. But there has been a change, and there has been a change in people's sense of what's safe too. I don't think the United States is going where Paris and London have gone, but I would say in general, the story of American history now for three centuries is that we've had Europe's problems, but in more moderate forms. That was true, all the way of the revolutions and the Industrial Revolution, and it's true of the demographic collapse in Europe versus the United States. It's true of religiosity. I think it's true of anti-Semitism too. It's worse in Europe, yes, but it is a real problem in America now in a way that I think a quarter century ago it was not.
Where just to circle back, or the press secretary of the White House likes to say, circle back. So I want to circle back about what we were speaking about, the two major parties and how bad they both are in terms of bringing people together. Because it used to be, like you said, you have to come to the middle, and both parties are reaching to their base instead of going to the middle. And what should we expect in Israel, for example, from a Kamala presidency, if you had to guess? And would it be just another extension of where we are with Biden, where on the one hand he's helping, but on the other hand he keeps on saying bad things about us, and then the Democrat Party, the leader of the Senate, goes and says our prime minister, again, whether you like him or not, I did not vote for him, but either way, he's democratically elected here. The Senate leader should not be calling for him to be ousted. And then you have Kamala, the vice president, saying, oh, there's too many people dying in Gaza, and some weapons are being held back, but we still support you. And we're putting sanctions on people just because they live in certain areas that we don't like. And so it's a mixed bag, but generally the tone isn't good. Or will she be more, will she actually policy-wise be, like we said, embargo on weapons and stuff that are really more serious? Where do you think she would be?
I think that the way to think about what it would likely be is to think about the Obama years. I think she would be a lot like Barack Obama. I think Barack Obama was very bad for Israel, but there are limits on what a president can do as a practical matter. The American support for Israel, military support, is actually enshrined in law in the United States, a law that is not about to change. There's just no way that the Democrats would have enough votes in Congress to do it, and not all the Democrats want to do it anyway. And that law actually does constrain how you can't have an arms embargo on Israel. What you would have to show Congress in order to do that is not going to happen. It would also be extremely unpopular with the American public, and Republicans are likely to still control the Senate, if not also the House, even if she wins. So I don't think she could go that far, but would she want to go that far? This is how I always thought about Barack Obama when he was president regarding Israel. I think he wanted to go further than he did in opposing Israel. I think the structural constraints on him helped Israel, but to the extent that he had room both to say things and to do things, he was not it was not good for Israel. I
Yeah.
think Kamala Harris is roughly in the same place.
Yeah, and I would just add that in the international bodies, the president has basically total power. For example, we know now that the international courts are asking for arrest warrants against the Israeli leaders, and we have the other court that's saying that they're debating whether Israel is committing genocide, and the way that America presents itself to these, and in the UN for a Security Council
That's
where
right.
the veto power is being used, those things are not things that are constrained by Congress. That
That's
is
right.
basically the president has carte blanche to do whatever she or he wants, right?
Absolutely. How to vote on a particular UN vote, how to vote in the International Court of Justice, those are decisions made by the administration. They don't have to consult anybody about it.
Right. So that I think is the more dangerous immediate thing, those types of things. We remember that when Obama at the end of his term, they didn't veto this anti-Israel resolution and everybody was saying, what happened? It's the end of his term. He's not constrained anymore by politics, and why not? So I think in that sense it's dicier. With Trump, I think you mentioned that you're more apprehensive about his character and all that, but the people around him are basically, I think, the same people. His family and the closer advisors, I think, are the same people. And the things he's been saying have been more basically what he said last time. Do you think that maybe because people like Tucker Carlson have become stronger, just the type of people stronger in the party, the isolationist wing has been growing, especially with regards to Ukraine, that maybe it'll spill over to Israel?
I do worry about that, but I think generally speaking, even the people who are most hostile to America's role in supporting Ukraine have distinguished that, separated that from what they say about Israel. It's worth looking at J.D. Vance, for example, the
Yes.
person who Trump's selected to be his vice presidential nominee. Vance is very hostile to American support for Ukraine, much more than Trump is.
Yeah.
But he has always drawn a distinction between Ukraine and Israel, and he has voted for everything in terms of supporting Israel, and not just voted, but spoken out in support of Israel during this war. So I think that distinction does still hold among Republicans.
Yeah, and Yoram Hazoni, when I interviewed him, Jade Vance goes to all his conferences.
Yep.
Even when they're in Europe, he sends in a video. So I asked him about it. He said J.D. Vance supports Israel, and he distinguishes between the two, Ukraine and Israel, on different reasoning. But the fact is that I want to ask one last question as a general sort of philosophical thing. With the whole point of the woke, it seems to me, is a worldview which sees everything from the dynamic of the oppressed and the oppressor. So when we're talking about Israel, obviously the Israelis have taken on, in these people's mind, the oppressor dynamic, and the Palestinians, Hamas, whoever, and are the oppressed. And if you take it to the logical conclusion, then Hamas is good because they are fighting the oppressor. And we see this in the protests, and some feminist people, Judith Butler, for example, said that Hamas and Hezbollah were part of the international feminist fight for justice. So,
Right.
if you take it to the logical conclusion, that's where you go. And I see it also, like we remember, a little bit on the right too, where people, because whatever happened in terms of institution wise, where they feel that everybody's against them, they sort of develop this mindset of being oppressed. And you have that also where in the Republican National Convention, it seemed to me that there was a lot of people claiming their victimhood, where we make a lot of fun of progressives saying all the time everybody's fighting to be the victim. Republicans seem to be going for that type of vibe also. And so I wanted to ask, in terms of American politics, has there ever been a time, you think, where it's so good to be a victim? Meaning you get all of this great adulation, sympathy, social credit. You get hired in jobs if you're a minority of different types. It's very lucrative to be a sexual minority, and if you're transgender, you'll get lots of different openings in terms of. So, has this ever been such a dynamic where everybody is trying to claim victimhood at the same time? There's not enough victimizers. Everybody wants to be a victim nowadays.
I think it's a very interesting dynamic. And I would say historically, the underlying difference between left and right might be understood as a difference between a view that says politics is essentially a relation of oppressor and oppressed. That has been the left's view since the end of the 18th century. Sometimes that's in economic terms, sometimes it's in cultural terms, or in power terms. Whereas the right has said politics is a dynamic between order and disorder, between civilization and barbarism. That
Yes.
often is how the right thinks about things. You still see that on the right. When Donald Trump talks about immigration, he's not thinking very philosophically about it, but he's talking about essentially in terms of a barbarian invasion. Or when people talk about order in the cities, without even really thinking about it, they resort to the language of order and chaos.
Yeah.
But there is a lot, I think, now of oppressor and oppressed language on the right as well. And the way in which our politics has become populist, so that it's more about up and down than left and right, I think has meant that populism, which is naturally a kind of leftist way of thinking, and which understands the people as being oppressed by elites, by their leaders, by powerful institutions and individuals, the more the right leans into that, the more the right tends to embrace the language of oppressor and oppressed. I think populism is not a natural fit for conservatism. There's some truth, clearly, to what populists on the right say, but I think it's very important that that be balanced by a sense of what it is that conservatives want to conserve and defend.
Right.
And that often is the institutions of society and the traditions of society, the religion of society. And there's much less of that language now in the rhetoric of the right in America than I would like to see, and than there used to be.
Do you think that one of the reasons is that, like, for example, I was looking at just statistics of declining church attendance in America. It's gone like it's skydived in the last 10, 15 years. I saw a poll not too long ago where young people in America were asked if they have one friend or more. And I forgot the exact number, so I don't want to say it exactly, but it was a surprisingly high amount of people who said they don't even have one friend. And the fact that people don't have friends, they don't have a community, they don't have a sort of higher calling where you go to church, even if you didn't believe in God, you had a community around you, you had people who you cared about in your life. And it seems that it's being lost. And what's coming instead of it is this everybody wants to be a victim. That is their higher calling. And this, does that make any sense what I just said?
Yeah, look, I think there is a dynamic where the weakening of institutions leaves people with a sense that there's just less to conserve. There's less to defend. What am I supposed to be protective of? And when people are isolated, alienated, feel like these big systems in society are there for other people and not for them, they may become they may become hostile to the left. They may become resentful of elites, but they're not exactly conservatives. And
Yes.
I think the right absolutely runs this risk as the institutions of society weaken. And so, ironically, the very fact that that weakening is happening, which is what conservatives worry about, comes to be a force that acts to undermine conservatism even within the right.
Yuval Levin, it's been an honor and a pleasure to talk to you. And
Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it a lot, and I appreciate it. And we'll keep in touch. So thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you.